pretty simple. And over the years, I've acquired gear like this Yamaha Stage Baby Grand, and actually there's a Rhodes Stage 88 or Suitcase 88 next to me. And I've acquired gear over the years that I really use and appreciate. The challenge, though, is as your genres change and experience with various equipment changes, new technologies and new keyboards come out, as well as guitars, and ultimately you begin adding quite a bit to your arsenal. The only thing that limits most people is money and space. Right now, can honestly say I'm running close on space, and it's time to just kind of rein it in, decide what I want to do with a lot of this gear, but then ultimately capitalize on it as I have in the past. My stories actually begins way back when I was 4 years old. Mom had us raised on piano, so at the age of 4 years, all of us kids began taking the basics. And part of that was Mom was part of the Oakland Junior Symphony back in those days before she met my dad. So for her, music and art was everything, and Dad was more the traditional Texas farmhand, which is the way he was raised. So for almost a decade, the only instrument I knew was the required band instruments, and then ultimately piano lessons until I was 13. At that point, I got to choose what I wanted to play, as well as the style and genre. So all of those years was classically trained, which sadly I haven't kept up, but it's part of my story. So the first instrument that really struck me that I had to know more about was the predecessor to this guy. So this is the 21st century version of the Mini Moog, and I've added what we've got here is a touch strip that allows slides and bends, but that wasn't part of the original instrument. And the original instrument didn't have this section. It was strictly just the sections on either side. So the Mini Moog was brought into my awareness with an artist that I later met by the name of Rick Wakeman. And Rick was the keyboard player for Yes. Progressive rock band, and that's what started my love affair with all sorts of instruments. So I completely obsessed and would ride literally half an hour to the public library there in Saratoga and rent a Mini Moog in a practice room, and I would get the opportunity to play it. Later, it became an obsession. It was still financially out of reach, but it was years ago, almost 20 years ago, that I picked up the Voyager, and I can tell you it's still everything in a lot of my compositions. One of the instruments that obsessed me early on was a classic electric piano. the Rhodes 88 that I have here is a much different beast than the Stage 73 that I had back in the day. The Stage 73 I loaded into my Dodge Dart with satellite speakers, and pictures should be here. The satellite speakers would all fit in the back seat, and the piano itself tucked nicely into the trunk with a pedal board that I utilized back in the day. Now, I only have one pedal from that era, but the pedal boards typically would be loaded with all sorts of pedals that altered a piano sound. And the first time you ever heard any of that was in some of Rick Wakeman's stuff, but also Billy Joel was using a phase shifter in his stuff. And that was the era that I started playing in various bands in the San Francisco Bay Area. So fast forward more than, I guess, 15 years after I got my first real mini Moog Voyager, I was able to acquire something that's very rare, and indeed was one of those instruments that is changing the face of modern music. This is the Moog 1, and it is an extraordinary instrument, and I'm just scratching the surface on it. So the Moog 1 is just an amazing instrument. And then the Jupiter here is a reissue that has the engines of all the Roland Jupiter, think late 70s, early 80s synthesizer sounds. That's what you've got. Behind me here that are part of the Legacy series, the grandmother here, and then this is the matriarch down below. Obviously, you can tell I haven't been getting enough playing time, but it's one of those things where you can pick up where you left off and honestly dig in and start creating right where you were. Which leads me into talking about guitars. So guitars for me have always been something I really admire and that I really appreciate. I had my first guitar. It was one of those typical Sears and Roebuck offerings with a very small transistorized amplifier. And it was frustrating beyond belief. So I literally gave up on trying to master the electric guitar. Lo and behold, it turns out that it wasn't me that was lacking, but it was the instruments. And I found this out 25 years later. So in my 30s, I was able to acquire, at a pawn shop, no less, a early prototype to the Stevie Ray Vaughan signature Stratocaster, and fell in love. Not only could I get the tones I wanted, but obviously it required practice to master, but it was fun to play. So over the years, I have tried out various different guitars, and each one, it's funny because the question was asked of my youngest boy. I had been giving him guitars off and on throughout the years, and I won't say who asked, but those that know the story know who. They said, "Why do you need so many guitars?" And he answered quite honestly, each one plays a little differently, and each one has different features that make it unique. You know, my answer would have been quite a bit simpler. It would have been, why do you need so many shoes? So the reality is many guitars have these features. They're not just six strings on a body, whether it's electric or hollow, but what it is some have tone capacitors that can be adjusted, some have volume and the pickups are wound differently. The acoustics are different. I just recently got an amazing wood, and I'll see if I can pull it out, acoustic electric from Fender called the Acoustasonic. So all of these things over the years have slowly grown in my collection. So over the years, I've taken the time to grow my skill set, my knowledge. This is a production workstation that allows me to record things digitally into a computer and then manipulate them and produce them the way we do today. A far cry from the Beatles and the Rolling Stones 4-track tapes that they started with. So with that, you know, there's all sorts of technology that you can get involved in, and I have. I'm one of those lifelong learners, so I'm constantly adding to my knowledge, whether it's reverb, EQ and compression, and mastering multiband, all the technologies behind it. And part of that is if you know how to record things, ultimately you don't have to do a lot less work if you've got talent. And for me, I've been blessed with at least the ability to read music and learn new instruments. So I've been working on that for, since my teens. So, so the collection grows over time. Additionally, collecting pedals has become a passion as well. And these are just a few of the pedals that are in storage that are not in the 8 different pedal boards that are already configured. And yeah, it's one of those collections where it has served me well. And let me explain. So I was asked years ago, why do you have all these things? And I said, they're an investment. And people don't see it that way. So the investment side of certain things allows us to not only park our money in something useful, but liquidate it for a profit later on. One of those things that is true is when it comes to classical musical instruments. I mean, look at the Stradivarius, right? Then if you look, and I did last night, if you look at some of the mini Moogs that were constructed in the early 70s, they're now selling for anywhere upwards of 10 grand and up. And I had at one period of time a couple of ARP 2600s. Here's a picture. And one of them was in working order, although very old. And I actually imported that from Norway. Then I had a couple that were in parts that I sent off to Phil Scirocco, who rebuilt it into a gorgeous, perfectly working instrument. That instrument, my investment and my money that I sent to Phil to get it done, I was able to recoup a 20% profit on top of that after he built it. And it actually funded a very necessary career move. So a lot of these instruments will very rarely get played, but they are indeed highly sought after and a great investment for those that know what they're collecting. So a couple of the more recent additions, there is a Fender Telecaster Custom that has an amazing tone varier within the push-pull knob. And then there's a Godin that actually allows me to play synthesizer through it as well. Other things that I really appreciate are I do have some boutique amps that allows just an amazing sound to come from the instruments, and people discount the value of a great amplifier. Both of these are considered boutique and actually quite wonderful. A couple other of the boutique amps are seen here, mostly Fender, and then there's a Supro tucked behind there. But one of the instruments that I'm learning currently is the Middle Eastern Electric Oud, which is in the case there. So one of the other things, just like I mentioned about the art, is I do buy instruments that are in need of repair or refurbishment. I've stripped the strings off this clavinet, and I'll give you guys an image of what they look like. And if you want to hear what a clavinet does, listen to Stevie Wonder's Superstition. That instrument is exactly this. So stringing all 60 strings on this 5 octaves is a chore, but it's been one of my refurbishment projects now for a little while. So I don't hesitate when it comes to vintage machines, because they don't make them anymore, and ultimately they are substantially worth quite a bit more. I can tell you, based on what I paid for this, I'm easily going to quintuple my money if I ever decide to sell it, and then some. So I'm adding in some features that are missing in the original, but also are highly in demand when people modify them. So that is one of the other collecting bugs that I do have. I'm not averse to learning and rebuilding instruments as well. So ultimately, music is a passion of mine, but the instruments are amazing to me. So I hope you enjoyed this brief look into one of my passions or obsessions, as the case may be. And I can say right at this point, I'm kind of at the tipping point where I think I'm done collecting. But there's always that one vintage piece that beckons, or the new innovative piece. So we'll see where that goes.